All right, hello guys. So this is the second part of the chapter 2 lesson. You should have already watched part 1 that shows you how to calculate different measures of central tendency. So now I want to do a practice problem for an interval ratio level variable. I have 2 sets of prices for jeans at 2 different stores, and I want you to tell me what's the appropriate measure of central tendency for each. So since we know that it's a interval ratio level variable, we have the mean and the median to choose from. Is it best to use mean or median for store 1, and is it best to use mean or median for store 2? So I encourage you to take a pause and try to do each of these on your own first, and then listen to my answers in just a minute. Okay, so here's the answers for store number 1. So in order to determine if we need to use mean or median, the first step is to figure out if there are outliers. To do that, you're calculating the median in the process. So first, list all of the values in order, high to low, low to high, doesn't matter. So this 15, 28, 35, 37, 42, etc., that's just the values that are given to you as part of the problem for store number 1. And then the first step is to calculate the median. Here we have an even number of values. There's 6 values. So there's not one value in the middle. There's 2 values in the middle. When there are 2 values in the middle, we take the mean of those 2 values. So 35 plus 37 divided by 2, that's the formula for the mean, gets us a median of 36. So our median is 36. Then to calculate our Q1, we're looking at the 3 upper values, the top half, and the middle value there is our Q1. Then we're looking at our 3 other values down here, our 3 high-end values, and the middle one is our Q3. Remember that if you just listed this in opposite order with the high value at the top and the low value at the bottom, your Q1 and Q3 would be the same. It's just your Q1 would be down here and your Q3 would be up here, right? Your Q1 would still be 28. Remember, your Q1 or your 25th percentile is always the lower value, and your 75th percentile or your Q3 is always the higher value. Okay, so this gives us our Q1 and Q3, which is needed for our next step, which is calculating our interquartile range, or our IQR. Remember, the formula for IQR is Q3 minus Q1. So our Q3 from over here we figured out is 42. Our Q1 is 28. That gives us an interquartile range of 14. Then we do the 2 formulas to figure out the upper and lower bounds for which an outlier would appear. The formula for the lower bound is Q1 minus 1.5 times our IQR. Our Q1 from over here is 28. Plug in our IQR from up here. Go ahead and solve the math on that one, and that gives us a lower bound value of 7. Then we do a formula as well for the upper bound value, that is Q3 plus 1.5 times the IQR. Our Q3 comes from over here. Fill in our IQR of 14, do the math on that, and that gets you an upper bound value of 63. Then we are asking ourselves, in the data set, is there a value that is less than 7 or greater than 63? We see here at the low end, there isn't a value that's less than 7, but there is a value that's greater than 63. If there's a value that's outside of this range, that's an outlier. So this $100 is an outlier. If there's an outlier, then the appropriate measure of central tendency is the median. Here our median is $36. So our best measure of an average for these jeans prices is 36. We're using the median because there's an outlier. Okay, same process for store 2. We need to figure out if mean or median is best. To do that, we need to know if there's an outlier. So again, we list all of the values in order. Here, these ones are just coming from the prices that are listed for store 2 in the problem you were given. Pick the middle two values, right? Because there's an even number of values, take the average or the mean of those, which is 37. Then we're taking the middlemost, our middlemost value of the lower values is our Q1. The middlemost value of our upper values is Q3. Calculating our interquartile range is Q3 minus Q1, those come from what we just figured out over here, gives us an IQR of 13. Then again, you're calculating that upper bound and lower bound for which an outlier would exist. We use the Q1 minus 1.5 times IQR for calculating our lower bound. We're plugging in our Q1 as 28 from over here, and our 13 is our IQR from up here. Solve the math on that, gives us a lower bound value of 8.5. The upper bound for an outlier is Q3 plus 1.5 times IQR. We plug in our Q3 value from over here, our 13 as our IQR. Solve the math on that, gives us 60.5. Then we're asking, in the data set, is there a value that's less than 8.5? Nope. Is there a value that's greater than 60.5? Nope. So that means there's no outliers. When there are no outliers, it's best to use the mean. Remember, to calculate the mean, we add up all of the values and divide by the number of values there are. So if we add up 15 plus 28 plus 35 plus 39 plus 41 plus 45, that gives us 203 divided by 6 is $33.83. So our final answer is in bold right here. The appropriate measure of central tendency or average for store 1 is the median, and the appropriate measure for store 2 is the mean, and here are their values. Okay, so I hope that is helpful practice for doing the measures of central tendency for interval ratio level variables. Good news is that a lot of this can also be done in Excel instead of needing to do it by hand. So I want to talk through how data are set up in Excel using both the Chapter 2 data set 1 as well as our class survey as examples. And then once we kind of understand how Excel organizes and keeps data, then we'll go through some of the steps for calculating the mode, mean, and median, our measures of central tendency. So let me first remind you where to find the, oops, and I closed that out. I apologize. Bear with me for just a minute. To find the data to open, we're going to our Canvas site. Then under modules, we scroll all the way down through all of the modules, including the ones I haven't filled in yet, to the bottom, and there's a whole separate unlocked module on data sets. You'll see that I have class surveys going back to 2014. Here's our class survey, open that one. And then for each of the chapters, there's a couple of different data sets just from that come from the textbook. So here we'll practice doing measures of central tendency with data set 1, but go ahead and open up on your own the 2020 Our Class Survey, as well as Chapter 2 data set 1. So I have both of these opened already. I want to start, because this is something you're more familiar with since you hopefully took the survey, you'll be able to kind of understand how Excel has things, and then we'll do some of the practices with central tendency in the Chapter 2 Dataset 2 survey. So you should have open Our Class Survey. Note first that there's 2 tabs here in Excel at the bottom left, one that's labeled data and the other that I've labeled codebook. Start first, make sure that the data one is selected. And what you'll see here is that in the data tab, each row is a different person or a different student, a different respondent. With the first row, though, being the different variable names. So our question 1 on the survey was, what was your gender? Question 2 was, do you live in a dorm on campus or someplace off campus? The question 4 was your class year, right? First year, sophomore, junior, senior, etc. Question 5 was, what are the number of states you visited, etc. With then this being, one of you responded that for everything in this row. And so the key part is that in the data file, the data tab, each row is a different person, right? Is how Excel I have the data organized in Excel. Note though that for gender, this doesn't say male, female, trans, etc. There's a numeric value there instead. And that's where you need to go to the codebook tab to understand what those values mean. So now in the bottom left, instead of clicking on having this data tab open, click on the codebook tab. And now you will see that for each row, there's a different variable explained. So for example, it says under variable name, for our question 1 on gender, this is the name of the variable. The label is in the second column, how that question is worded on the survey. And then the third column under values, here's the most important part. This tells you how that variable is coded in the data sheet. So this tells us that 0 means the person is male and 1 means the person is female. Same thing for the second question on, do you live in a dorm on main campus? People answered 0 for, these answers are coded as 0 for no or 1 for yes, right? And so you can go through and see all of the other variable codings as well. So this gives you an idea, I think, of the key parts of how the data are set up. If it's helpful for you to kind of think through and feel comfortable with using or looking at data in Excel, perhaps try to identify which person is you, which number is you. Remember, these are anonymous, but that this hopefully gives you an overview of how data are set up in Excel. Okay, so that's our class survey. We'll do other problems, including from the classwork assignment for this using the class survey, but that kind of gets you set up with how Excel organizes data. Then have open the Chapter 2 data set 1. So again, this is in that module, the data sets module in Canvas. Chapter 2 data set 1 has just 2 variables, one that's labeled prejudice and one that's labeled gender. So remember, when I'm in the data tab, each row here is a different respondent and it is a different person. And if I click on the code book, then it explains what each of these mean, right? So here for gender, we see that the values are labeled here. And the other variable, prejudice, the label explains that this is a score ranging from 0 to 100 for how many prejudiced beliefs somebody has, with higher scores meaning they have greater levels of prejudice. Obviously for this one, because it's an interval level variable, then we don't need some type of value, right? It's not like the nominal and ordinal level variables, the categorical variables, in which we need to explain how those are coded and ranked, right? We know that this is just a number. Same thing like from our student survey, the number, for example, the question on what's the number of siblings you have, we know that 1 means 1 sibling or 5 means 5 siblings. That one doesn't need any type of explanation in the values in the code book. Okay. Chapter 2 data set 1. So let's go through, make sure you're in go back to the data file, and we can practice going through how to do these different analyses, measures of central tendency in Excel. So Excel is doing the work for you. make sure you have out the last page of the lesson outline starts with the title Analysis in Excel and breaks down the instructions step by step in writing already for you for how to do each of these, so you don't have to take additional notes while doing it. But I'm going to talk through each of these steps with you. So the first one is on calculating mode. Remember, we only use the mode if it's a nominal or ordinal level variable for a categorical variable. Here, gender is our categorical variable. So we might want to calculate the mode for gender. Which one occurs more frequently? That's our mode. So to do this, select any cell anywhere here. We could even do it way out here. Any cell, any box where you want the answer to go, right? So just make sure you're not selecting over one of the data points that's already listed. Select any blank cell and then type in what's listed in your lesson handout here. Is make sure you always put equals first in this formula box at the top above where the data set is. Type equals first. I will say now, people always tell me I'm having trouble with Excel. It's not working. It's not calculating the way that I want it to. I'm getting an error message. 90% of the time, the reason for the error is you forgot to put this equal sign first. So always, always, always equal sign first. Type equals and then mode, parentheses, and then you're letting Excel know what's the range of values for which you want to calculate the mode. Here, this is cell B2, right? We're in row B, excuse me, column B, row 2. We want to calculate the mode for everything from B2 down to B21. So to do that, we put in B2 and then the colon tells Excel this is a range, right? So B2 colon B21 in parentheses. You should always see then Excel selects for you after you type that in what is the correct area that you want to figure out the mode for. Then press enter. This gives you a value here of 0. Well, what does 0 mean as a mode? It depends on how your variable is coded here, right? So here we need to go back to the code book and figure out what does 0 mean. Here 0 means male, so we know that our modal category, our mode, is male. So this is the tricky part. Excel will give you the number, but you need to then go to the code book and say, here's what that number means. What is the category that number represents? Here, it's male. Okay, next example or problem. Go ahead and delete that 0 if you want, or keep it, it doesn't matter. Checking for outliers. So before we know if we want to calculate the mean or the median, we need to know if there's outliers. And so to do this, it's helpful to set up like a little data sheet for yourself or a little spreadsheet that labels each of the data points we're going to be finding. So I encourage you to find any blank space and make these following categories. One that's labeled Q1, one that's labeled Q3, one that's labeled IQR, one that's labeled lower bound or lower B, and one that's labeled upper bound or upper B is fine too, to abbreviate quicker. Okay. Then know this is helping you remember all of these numbers you're going to be calculating, what they actually represent. It's helpful to be able to keep track like that. So in order to calculate for our outliers, we first need to figure out what's our Q1. The formula for Q1, as I have in your lesson handout on page 5 as well, type equals, don't forget the equals, quartile, and then the range for which you're looking at data. So here we know prejudice, this is the interval level variable. So we're doing the, what is the appropriate measure of central tendency, either mean or median for the prejudice score, the prejudice ranking here. So we type in A2 to semicolon A21. Make sure that all of your little punctuation is correct. A2 to A21, that should select it for you. And then comma 1, and then close parentheses. That gives you the first quartile value. So look at where I have typed in the formula box. Make sure yours resembles that exactly. And then press enter. That gives you then your Q1 value is 80. Then you're doing the same thing for Q3. Make sure your cursor down here is in the cell where you want the answer to go next to Q3. Is you type in quartile, same range of cells, right? We're looking at all of the data that are between A2 and A21. Now we do comma 3 for the third quartile, for the 75th percentile, and press enter. Now we have our Q1 and our Q3 values. We can calculate our IQR. So remember, the IQR is Q3 minus Q1. Now you need to figure out whatever cell your Q3 is in. Here I'm in E4, right? Column E, row 4. And here our Q1 is in row E. I don't know why I keep getting my columns and rows mixed up. Column E, row 3. So make sure that you have the cursor on the box for where you want the IQR answer to go. And you type equals, our Q3 answer is in box E4 minus E3, gives us our IQR of 14. You can also always just look at and count in your head if you want. Q3 is 94 minus Q1 is 80, and know that that's 14, and type that in as well. That's totally fine too, if you don't want to do the actual formula for IQR. Okay, next step, finding the lower bound. So remember the formula for our lower bound. You're typing in the Q1, and here you can either, first push equals, either put in the actual cell for Q1, so you could type here E3, or you could just type in the actual Q1 value if that's less confusing. You're doing our Q1 minus 1.5 times, do the little star that's above the 8 on your keyboard, times our IQR, and again, you can fill in the cell for IQR or the actual IQR value, which is 14. Press enter, that does the math for you. So here again is the 80 is our Q1 minus 1.5 times the IQR, gives us our lower bound value. Then for our upper bound, we're doing Q3. Our Q3 here is 94 plus 1.5 times our IQR is 14. That gives us an upper bound of 115. So now we know that if there's a value that's less than 59, it's an outlier. And if there's a value that's greater than 115, it's an outlier. So you can visually just scan here and say, is there a value that's less than 59, greater than 115, and identify that there is one. Especially with a large data set, here's a helpful trick to organize your data. So if you select this column, go over to the top right to sort and filter. You can sort smallest to largest or largest to smallest, and that might make it easier to identify one that's outside of those bounds, right? So here we see that there is an outlier, and when there's an outlier, median is the better one to use. Okay, calculating then the mean and the median. So For prejudice here, we know that we should be using the median because there's an outlier, but just for practice, I'm going to first show you how to calculate the mean, and then we'll do the median as well. So again, it's helpful to kind of leave little, set up a little table for yourself so you remember what values fit with what. To calculate the mean, all you need to do is type in equals, average, and then the range of the data that you want to calculate the average for. So here, this is cell A2 to A21, average A2 to A21. Our average is 85. To calculate the median, which for this one, because we've figured out there's an outlier, that 55 is an outlier, we know we would use the median as our best measure of central tendency. But to calculate the median then, you make sure your box is selected where you want the answer to go. You press equals, median, and then put in the range of values you want it to calculate the median for. Our A2 to A21, A2 colon A21, and our value for our median comes up there. So if you had a question on the classwork or a homework that said use Excel to calculate the appropriate measure of central tendency for prejudice, you would go through and do all of the steps that I just did. And once you saw that there was an outlier of 55, you wouldn't need to calculate the mean. You would just go ahead and calculate the median and give the median as your final answer. If, however, this lower bound was something like 50 and there was not an outlier, then your appropriate answer for the measure of central tendency would be the mean of 85. Okay, anything I'm forgetting? I think that's it. So now you should be able to calculate all measures of central tendency by hand as well as in Excel. So next step is to go forward and do the classwork assignment for chapter 2 on your own, then check against my answer sheet, and I'll also have up shortly by Wednesday at the latest, the verbal explanation for the classwork problem. All right, you guys are doing great. Keep it up.